Well, hello everybody. I can see a few more people are just about to join, but I'm going to get the slides up so that we're ready to get going. So those of you that know me will know that I'm really interested in research ethics, particularly around researching sensitive issues such as gender-based violence. So it's a real pleasure to sort of do this today, and it's going to be a very quick whistle-stop tour. If I give you a bit of my background, that I was originally a quantitative researcher, only ever did quantitative. I really liked hard science. And when I moved into researching gender-based violence, which I realised that's what I wanted to do during the course of my undergraduate degree, even though I did my PhD in quantitative, it meant there had to also be this shift in my way of thinking. I'd also had become as an academic, I'd become quite disillusioned with much of what I was seeing in mainstream psychology. I'd trained to become a forensic psychologist. I did the first part of the training and realised it was all just about scales and measuring stuff, but often not measuring the right thing. And there was also this sense of being objective. And that started to worry me, thinking, well, I don't think we are as objective as we'd like to think. And I'd come from a background initially in chemistry and physics and worked in the pure sciences, so to speak. And in psychology, I didn't really think we could be as objective as we were in those environments. So in 2010, I came across a group of people at the British Psychological Society who were all feeling like me. It was like an AA meeting, where we all got together in a room and we created a section of the BPS called Community Psychology. And really it was about a bunch of psychologists who were disaffected with mainstream psychology, who recognised that actual problems were not necessarily located within individuals, but often to do with society and the ways systems work around us. So issues were bigger than individuals. And so I come from this community psychology background, really, which very much resonates with feminist researchers from the sociological tradition. So I'm going to start with a quote from Ali, who in 2006 said that in traditional psychology, there's been a distinct neglect of the study of social problems, things like homelessness, unemployment, substance misuse, gender-based violence. And I remember thinking that when I was doing my undergraduate programme. I did psychology and criminology, and I was only seeing these hard-hitting actual phenomenon that I wanted to study were only appearing in the criminology and the sociology. They were never appearing in the psychology. So in particular, they never study these within an ecological framework. Rather, they focus specifically on locations of cause within the individual, rather than looking at causes or moderating influences within the community, social, cultural factors. And as I said, I felt this strive for objectivity often conflicted with conducting socially responsible research. And if I give you an example, for many years I've taught about genocide and child soldiering. And when I first started teaching about child soldiering in the early 2000s, there was no academic research on this. It was all reports that were coming out of NGOs who were working on the ground with this young group of people who had been highly traumatized. Their reports were incredibly graphic, but I got a real sense of what was going on and what it was like for them and the problems that they were likely to encounter. Then about 15 years later, psychologists got involved in exploring the issue of child soldiering and the impact on former child soldiers. And as I started to look at the academic articles, they were incredibly sanitised, to the point where you wouldn't have known what the experience was. All you knew that there was a difference in test scores pre and post being put through a reintegration programme. But what that really meant in real terms was really quite vague. And so for me, it lost in any sense of reality of what this was really about. So I think, and they were trying to be objective, whereas the people that were writing the NGO reports, they weren't trying to be objective. They were trying to shout out to the world to tell them what was going on and what was needed. And I see really my role is to do the shouting out. So not only have traditional psychologists neglected the inclusion of topics related to people who are oppressed, deprived or marginalised, they've also been guilty on occasions of misinterpreting research findings, typically as a consequence of decontextualising the experience. And the outcome of this can actually be quite harmful to the research populations. And to me, this is a big ethical issue. And if I give you some examples of this, some years ago, I was doing some work on domestic violence. And I became very aware of a lot of the academic articles I was reading that actually problematised women, particularly who had been victims of domestic violence, who hadn't left their partner, who had been the perpetrator of the violence. And the titles of these articles were very much about why does she stay? Well, you know, what's wrong with her? What's making her stay? And it was never to do with what women said themselves why they stay. Well, I'm committed to this relationship and I want it to become violence free. You know, I'm in love with this person. It was always seen in terms of pathology. She's got Stockholm syndrome. There's traumatic bonding going on. And it means it's really reinforced this essentialist view to the way in which we treat the solution of domestic violence, which is the only way of resolving domestic violence, is for the safe and permanent separation of the couple. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't reduce the violence, it just moves the violence to other potential victims. And unfortunately, the victim may actually then find themselves in another relationship that also becomes violent. So it's just problematized the victims in this instance. There's also the formulation of domestic violence being an issue for minority ethnic groups, particularly when we look at issues around honour-based violence. There's also been some work done up in the University of Central Lancashire, really focused on the use of the conflict tactic scale, which is a measure of different forms of domestic violence that people might have either perpetrated or experienced within their relationships. There's nothing wrong with this scale, and in fact it's very good, but in its early forms, every instance of something he might have done was classified as 1 point on the scale. And I remember giving my students an example that if I'd got my 21 stone partner, and at the time I was 7 stone, and he had shoved me, resulting in me being thrown down the stairs and breaking a leg, that would count for the same as me throwing a cushion at the floor in an argument because I'd thrown something. Actually, the impact of what we were doing didn't have the same level of intensity or the level of harm that could have been caused. But much of the research using the conflict tactic scale had demonstrated what we call gender symmetry in domestic violence. And it was saying that there's an equal level of domestic violence perpetration in both men and women within heterosexual relationships. Well, we do know that women do commit violence within heterosexual relationships, but what we do know also is that men commit far more. They're much more likely to use coercive control, and actually the level of injuries sustained, particularly lethal injuries, are much greater when it's male on female domestic violence. So this problem has led to this sort of fight in-house amongst domestic violence researchers about is there gender symmetry or asymmetry, and it's almost like a power struggle that's been going on. There was also a meta-analysis done in the early 2000s by Reid and colleagues, and this meta-analysis looked at the long-term effects of child sex abuse, and it's one of the most highly cited articles that's ever existed within psychology. It's not highly cited because people are so in favour of it, it's so highly cited because the level of criticism against it. Now, that meta-analysis actually demonstrates that there's no long-term impact of child sexual abuse. Now, as researchers that have been working in this area for a very long time, we would say, well, that's unlikely to be true, that we know that there is a proportion of people that say that they're impacted throughout their life. Not everybody, but there's a significant proportion of people that say the impact of child abuse is a lifelong occurrence, that you're constantly trying to move on from, but it will every now and again rear its ugly head again. Now, actually, if you look at the meta-analysis done by Reid and colleagues, actually all of their samples from the studies that they included in the meta-analysis were drawn from university samples. Now, to be honest, if you've made it to university and you happen to have been on campus on the day that survey was released, then chances are you're a survivor who's thriving and may not at that point be demonstrating any long-term effects. That's not to say that you won't be having the effects in 2 weeks' time or a year's time, but you're not actually exhibiting them now. Now, I think rather than the way in which they frame the study of saying there's no long-term effects, what they needed to say is there's great hope for a lot of survivors of child sex abuse, that actually the effects don't need to be long-term, that for many people that they will be able to move forward, even though they have periods where they may actually relapse every now and again. There is another study, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce the name of the authors, but it was an article in the British Journal of Criminology from 1975. So do go and see if you can find it. And it's called Victim Precipitated Cases of Paedophilia. And I remember giving this to a group of my third year students to read many years ago. And they all took this article at face value. And basically the article said that 62% of cases of child sex abuse were actually precipitated by the child's own behaviour, by the child choosing to go to visit the perpetrator or sitting on the perpetrator's lap, or engaging in other flirtatious behaviour. When you look at the sample age of the children referred to in this paper, we're talking about children as young as 2. Clearly they cannot have precipitated this, but that's how the paper is framed. And it's only when you dig deep into the paper that you realise that how did they get this information? How did they know it was victim precipitated? And hey ho, it turns out that the source of this information was those who've been accused of child sexual abuse themselves. So the perpetrators had actually said it was the children that precipitated. Now, the very title of that paper is misleading. The title of the paper should have been something along the lines of perpetrators' perceptions of victim precipitated cases of paedophilia. That way we'd have had it in our minds that this statement isn't necessarily true, but it's the way that one group of people want to frame this. And to me, all of these things are an ethical issue. If we think about the different approaches to ethics, when we think about our ethics principles that we all adhere to within our own disciplines, such as the British Psychological Society's ethical guidelines, they're based on a number of different approaches. So we have utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. So utilitarianism very much focuses on we can do something which is for the greatest good, for the greatest number of people. And so therefore we would use the concept that the ends justify the means. So if you harm 1 or 2 people along the way, but at the end of the day it's going to do a greater good, then we'd go along with that. I would imagine that when we've been thinking about all the testing for the COVID vaccines, we've had to go along those lines in many instances. However, when we think about informed consent, we're much more likely to be leaning towards deontology, so this notion of having free will. So the idea that we're giving enough information that we can choose whether or not as participants to take part in a particular study. And we need to be able to make the decision of whether somebody actually has that autonomy or has the ability to consent. The other part of ethics I think I'm really interested in is virtue ethics, and this much more focuses on the qualities of the researcher, so having compassion, engaging in honesty, humility, focusing on wanting justice and engaging in practical reasoning. And this much more resonates with the feminist ethic of care. So the idea that not only do you care about the topic that you're studying, but you also demonstrate care for your research participants and your fellow team members. So if we think about all the things that we engage in when we're thinking about our ethics proposals, the whole idea about informed consent, and we talk about the avoidance of deception if we can, there might be occasions when deception might be necessary, because without it, the study would have no relevance. So it's not to say we can't do it, but there needs to be a really big justification to do that. We need to ensure that our participants have the right to withdraw, and that actually we enact that all the way through the research process. And I've had huge debates over many, many years with people about at what point does somebody's right to withdraw actually end. In most instances, there's ways of allowing people to withdraw their data right up until the point that you're conducting the data analysis. So there should be that. I have heard people say that people should be able to withdraw their data even once you've gone beyond that stage, but that does make things difficult. We need to actually be having some benefit for our participants if we can. That's not always possible, but sometimes there are things that turn out to be beneficial that we hadn't anticipated, and I'll come on to those in a minute. We need to protect people from harm as much as possible, so the harm shouldn't be any greater than they'd experience within their normal day. And this becomes really quite important when we're working, particularly with survivors of gender-based violence, because chances are that we're actually going to get them to either relive their negative experiences, either of the harm itself or of things that have happened subsequent to the harm, but due to the harm. The notion of debriefing and actually ensuring that we give good debriefing. Often we find that where people do experience harm after participation in studies, it's typically about 2 days later when the impact actually hits people once they've had a chance to assimilate and consider what it is that they've just been through. Confidentiality has always been quite a big one, and obviously in some cases in the work that we do there might be limits to confidentiality, and people need to know about that up front. I've also always had the notion that confidentiality is quite a tricky one, particularly when we're doing qualitative research, that we might want to have a confidential environment when we're collecting data so that somebody knows that nobody else is overhearing what's being said, because they've still got a right to withdraw anything they've said up until later. So they could have a conversation with you that's confidential. You could then remove information later. But later it becomes less confidential once you're starting to prepare things to be written up, and you're going to be using somebody's direct quotes in your reports or your articles. It's not actually confidential, but what you're then doing is anonymizing. So actually the person's identity is hidden and nobody will know who they are. In relation to things I've just said about those other studies where I felt they did a service to victims, I think social responsibility becomes really quite key. Why are we doing what we're doing and whose benefit is it in? Are we doing anything that's victim blaming, or is there could our data be used in any wrongful way? Have we got the actual competence to carry out the study that we're proposing to do? Do we know that we can handle ourselves? Have we got support systems in place to do that, to what we're doing? And is what we're doing non-discriminatory? And I hope nobody's here, because I can't see who's here, from the psychology department, because a few years ago we had quite a big heated debate about inclusion and exclusion criteria for participants to some of our studies. And this really revolved around the idea that they wanted us to say that if you've been a victim of sexual assault, it should be stated on the participant information sheet that you should not be allowed to participate. Now, to me, that would be discriminatory. It's saying to victims of sexual violence, your voice doesn't count and we don't want to hear from you. So we had the debate about, well, what if somebody was homeless? What if they'd had a mental health problem? What if they had been an alcoholic? And people were giving timelines. Well, we should say that they shouldn't take part if this has happened within the past 2 years, 1 year, if they're no longer receiving treatment. And I said, but you still want victims of sexual violence to never take part. And everybody's, yes, that's true. I said, so once a victim, always a victim. Whereas if you're an offender, at least you get a chance to become an ex-offender, but you don't with victims. Now, to me, that's incredibly discriminatory. I think people have experienced interpersonal violence themselves, gender-based violence or sexual violence, have the ability to know whether or not it's good for them to take part. If you give them enough information so they know what's expected, enough time to actually consider whether or not they want to engage, and good opportunities for ceasing engagement, they can make that decision for themselves. And actually, I think not only is it discriminatory, but it's infantilizing to do otherwise. So Fabia talks about the principles of effective feminist research, and one of the key things is that the relationship between the research and the research should be collaborative and non-exploitative. So I really hate this idea of running in and snatching people's data and running out again. I feel that once somebody has allowed you to do an interview with them, or have completed your survey, or taken part in a focus group, they have given you this golden nugget. It's a prize to be cherished, and you should really, really value that. So we should reduce this alienation between the researcher and the researched. So whenever I'm doing research, I try to work out, the type of group I'm going to, and I just want to be one of the people that I'm researching. I'm not going to go and be this big professional or an expert above them. I'm just one of them. And that really comes from my work from when I worked in mental health. Luckily, in those days, not good for my health, I'd have to admit, but in those days I used to smoke roll-ups, and it was a great way of reducing all power differences, that you always went outside the building, rolled a cigarette and shared your tobacco. It brought you down to being one of them. And I think there's something about being humble in doing the research with other people that have got experiences far greater than their own. We should also involve those that we're researching within the research process. They can be right there right from the very outset. So helping us design the study, looking at interview schedules, the tools that we're going to develop, the processes that we're going to use, and even helping in the analysis of the data or making sense of the data after we've analysed it. Our research isn't just about creating sort of our research findings or building our careers. Research should be transformative for the people who've taken part in it. And it was really heartening last week in the India conference, hearing about the transformation the young people have taken part in the work package 4 surveys. So when we heard from the school principal saying that it'd given children voice to actually speak out abuses that had been done against them, and felt that they'd been empowered to actually speak out like that. I've also done other research in the past where I've done interviews with young men about their experiences of gaining consent in relationships where their partner may have dissociated and frozen and become slightly unresponsive or very unresponsive. Actually, in planning that research, we spent over 18 months planning that study, thinking about all the negative things that might come out of it. One of the things that really came out was our debriefing session, rather than lasting 10 minutes as we'd anticipated, lasted sometimes an hour and a half, because young men were saying, this is the first time that anybody's ever talked to us about this. I had no idea. And we'd anticipated that some people might say to us, oh, I think I've done that. I've had sex with somebody that was non-responsive. And that we'd plan that we'd be non-judgmental and use it as a learning exercise. And many of the men wrote to us afterwards thanking us for actually taking the trouble to do this, because they just said, I had no idea, and from now on I've got strategies that I would use to ensure that somebody was still fully consenting and fully present during any sex, and that they would have other ways of dealing with things. Sarantagnos then argues that it's not so much that feminist researchers use different methodologies in doing their research, but it's the fact that they use conventional methods in particular and very different ways. So we try to argue against oppression, discrimination and marginalisation. We try to use our findings in ways that are supportive of the people that we're researching, particularly when they're survivors, rather than discrediting them further. And that we would try to be as caring as possible in the way in which we do our research, and for our research process to be as empowering as possible. So one of the core features of feminist research is the use of reflexivity as a source of insight, and this becomes really important. If I just give you an example quickly about one of my very dear PhD students from many, many years ago, called Cynthia, who on analysing her interviews, and she'd done interviews with survivors of adult sexual assault, she realised that she was amending what she'd said to make coherent sentences, because she realised that when we speak, we don't tend to use very much coherent language. So she amended her own language, but she left her participants' language as was. So with the ums and ahs and you knows, you likes, and all those sort of little colloquialisms within that. On sending back her first interview transcript to her participant, the participant on reading it said to her, I feel so stupid, I sound like an absolute idiot. I didn't realise I was so thick. And Cynthia then reflected and said, you know what, I've realised I've actually disempowered her further by making myself look better and more professional by changing my own wording. Now, she could either have left her own wording the same, and she reflected on this for a while as to what would be the best thing. And she decided, because of the nature of the analysis she was conducting, that actually she could also amend the participants' words So not change the actual words, but to reduce the ums and the ahs and the you knows and likes, and to take those bits out and to leave the actual meaning behind. Nobody ever complained again. And for her, that was a real learning and a sense of empowering her participants. So in qualitative research, particularly action research, it's difficult, if not impossible, to preempt all the issues of ethical conduct at the outset of the study. So we're normally at the proposal stage and seeking ethical approval. We're made to think about everything that might go wrong. And there's some things that might go wrong or challenge us that we hadn't foreseen. And we've got to always be responsive to that. Sorry, he has something to say about that too. So therefore, within our studies, we need to be continually responsive to the social, personal and contextual situations that might challenge us in terms of our ethics. And if we think about the way in which lockdown has hit us, it's meant that we've had to change many things about the way in which we'd have done things. The key thing for me has been the issue of confidentiality. So when I'm doing an interview remotely, I can't guarantee the other person is on their own, that they're not going to be disturbed. And at the point that I had my son and my daughter-in-law living here, that they might have walked into the room. And so you're having to put strategies in place to ensure that things are confidential and that you're not leaving computers open and things like that. I realise I'm running low on time, so I'm going to quickly zap through. So typically the process of gaining ethical approvals from the ethics committee is seen as this one-time event, but in reality, it goes on and on and on. And I think we always need to reflect on those things, and often we're going to need to actually be seeking a revision to our ethics, if not just discussing with others that are most of you more knowledgeable and experienced than ourselves about what we should do. And I think the ethics aspects continues all the way through to the dissemination stage. And if I give you the example very briefly of about a PhD that was done at Glasgow University back in, I think, 2005 or 2007. But it was on the benefits of paedophilia for the child victims. And the researcher there had actually posed as a boy lover on the internet and had contacted other child sex offenders who'd been grooming children online, and he'd asked for details of the children that they'd been contacting so that he could then himself contact these children and ask the children what benefits they had from their relationship with the perpetrator that they'd met online. And unsurprisingly, the children gave all sorts of benefits that they received and cited all sorts of things. Now, if you can imagine that PhD has never been allowed to be released from Glasgow University. It's not available for public consumption at all. And that's not surprising. How that got through ethics, goodness knows, because the fuel that would give to perpetrators and to others who are defending them would be to say that, look, children think that they gain benefit from these relationships with people that are manipulating and exploiting them. So actually, we don't need to do anything about it, or that maybe we should stop making this behaviour illegal. So right through to dissemination, ethics still applies. So when researching gender-based violence, it's important to be cautious, again, of not replicating the violation of trust which survivors might have experienced in the context of their victimisation. So making choices for them. It's about empowering them to make their own choices. So we don't want to oppress the oppressed or render powerless those who've already lacked structural power. So we've got to ensure that our processes are amenable to actually fulfilling our desires in that instance. For me to empower somebody, I want them to be fully informed at the outset. So if I'm doing interviews, I will send them the interview schedule alongside the participant information sheet. The questions are indicative, and what I say to people on the information sheet, if there's something on here that you don't want to talk about, just highlight that to me beforehand, and we won't go down that route. We'll ignore those questions. Similarly, if there's something on here that you think I haven't mentioned that you think is pertinent to me addressing the research question, please feel free to add that. And actually what I found over the years in doing this, it means I don't have to memorise my interview schedule, that people actually have a chance to actually think about what they want to tell me. They don't have the same level of regret over having been interviewed, because they've they've known what they want to say, they haven't spurted something out unexpectedly, and that all becomes very important. I also engage in a process of what I call contingency planning. So this means that actually prior to the interview, I actually say to people, how do you want me to respond if you should become upset? How would you like to be handled? And if I think back to one of my interviews I did with a survivor, she actually said to me, if I'm going to be upset, I want to walk out of the room and I'll go into the kitchen, and I don't want you to follow me. I don't want you to tell me this interview is ending. I'll decide that for myself, but you sit there and wait for me to come back out and for me to decide what I want to do. And as it is, that person was amazing, because she actually decided the interview would be done at her friend's house. She didn't want to taint her own house. This was in the days before COVID, by the way. So her friend was actually waiting upstairs. They'd planned to go and have a lovely lunch afterwards. So I was sat in a neutral environment with her. It wasn't her home. It wasn't my office. It wasn't somewhere that felt sanitised. It's somewhere she felt comfortable, but also wasn't going to be somewhere that was tarnished. She had a box of tissues on the table ready, and she had a glass of water each. And she never did have to get up and go out to the kitchen, and she never did need to use the box of tissues. But she said that the fact that we talked about this contingency planning ahead of time meant that she felt she'd been empowered to plan for herself how she wanted to handle it and have everything to hand and ready. And that had really helped her. But at the end of the interview, she actually said, this is the first time in my life I've ever managed to talk about this without crying. And it's just because I felt so empowered by the process. So I just think there's little things that you can do that make life easier for your participants. I'm not going to have a chance to go through what process consent is, and there's not much point anyway, although I think it's a brilliant idea. I've never had an ethics committee that's permitted me to do it. And if anybody wants to know more about it, do come and get hold of me. One of the other issues I have, and I'm only going to touch on this very quickly because I want to be able to fit in the next workshop, is about the idea of privacy in the research context. Privacy means having control over the extent, timing, and the circumstances of sharing oneself, and that's behaviourally, physically or intellectually with others. And this is particularly important within the interview context. We've got to remember somebody's information belongs to them. So their recounting of their experience, it belongs to them. It's not ours for the taking. And I see lots of stuff around the idea at the beginning of an interview about building rapport to make people tell you more. And actually, I feel that's a really manipulative tactic and not something that I'd want to endorse. I think that you should build rapport anyway, but not as a means to manipulate. I don't think we should get people to disclose more than they actually want to. And I think some disclosures come out like what I'd call a fire hydrant. It's the idea that somebody hadn't been anticipating saying something, but you've triggered a memory in them, and unfortunately everything comes flooding out. Not only does this lead to them experiencing secondary trauma, but it also increases the possibility of regret. And I think by giving them the interview schedule beforehand, reminding them that you move into the next section and testing that it's okay to do that, actually prevent that from happening. And that to me is really, really important. I do not want to be seen manipulating my participants. So all the ethical issues then, we need to frame our research questions to present our findings that have implications for distributive justice. We want to do justice for the people that we're interviewing. So the study's design should be created to generate knowledge that will benefit the wider group of people from whom the study participants are drawn, and not to further stigmatise or marginalise them in any way. It should include efforts to avoid victim blaming perspectives or the tendency to render pathological the population represented by the participants. And if I give you the example of a few years ago doing a literature review for victim support, who were about to run a new service for survivors of historic child sex abuse in the wake of the independent inquiry that was going on at the time. And they said because of the short time frame we had to do the literature review, that we'd have to use all the best literature possible to draw from systematic reviews and meta-analysis and things like that. And so initially they were the only types of studies that I collected, but all of those talked about survivors of sexual violence as having psychological disorders. It was all depression, anxiety, psychopathy, psychosis, all these borderline personality disorder, which I just felt if we were going to be using that, we'd be actually pathologising this population, and it gives no sign of a sense of hope for the future. So I then extended it and drew on qualitative literature with the agreement of victim support when I actually flagged this problem, which actually highlighted other struggles that people had that weren't to do with their mental health, but were to do with struggles with living and relationships that they might want support with, but also flagged the fact that actually many people do move forward and have thrive in their lives. Don't you? Oh, sorry, there's a lorry just pulled up. So we need to really consider then the funding and policy implications of our projects. I'm not going to go through these because Nick's going to want to shout at me. But just to say that ethics is more than what we fill in on our standard ethics forms. We need to think much more broader than that to do justice to our research. So thank you very much. It was just a whistle-stop tour, but it's been a pleasure to see you all, if only I could. So if I can come out of here. And will I have time just for 1 or 2 questions, Nick?
Yeah, we've got one question which has come through during that session, which is whether there's an ethical risk that by involving perpetrators in the research process or in the debriefing process, that you equip them with strategies that they could use to carry out further abuses in the future.
Okay, well, I would say perpetrators are not a disempowered group, so I don't need to empower them by too much participation. I'd want to not empower them, I might want to have their involvement to see how they feel. I think if my research was to feel very discriminatory against them, we're not going to get their involvement. So I might want to involve them in just saying how does this look to you? Would this be off-putting? And making it more palatable to get participants. But I wouldn't be using them, as you say, to give them more knowledge so that they could become more manipulative. And I think the difference is I could do a whole big lecture, which I used to do, on researching perpetrators. It's a very different issue.